Hi, I'm Dave Yard, Executive Director here at the National Auto and Truck Museum in Auburn, Indiana. Today we're getting ready to launch a world-class international exhibit known as the Legends of NASCAR. With us today, we're fortunate to have one of the owners of one of our legendary cars here at the exhibit, Mr. Boris Benuti, who owns the 1964 Richard Petty number 43 Plymouth.
Hi, I'm Boris Benuti, and I'm very fortunate to be here at NATMUS. This is a great opportunity for us to continue on a path of sharing what we feel is a strong representation of history that's very important to me, but this beautiful car built by Richard Petty Garage, and had the involvement of all the original members of that key team. So Dale Edmond, Maurice Petty, Richard Petty, and the people working at the crew at Petty Garage, and many of them were former employees of Petty Motorsports when Richard was still operating his race program. Why would I take on a project like this? It's because just like so many other fans of NASCAR from the 60s, we need these stories. We need this history to keep moving forward for the next generation. That's what this car represents. How did this project start? I was with an associate down in South Georgia looking for parts for a 1958 Regal Lancer. And we tripped across a group of people that were collectors of older cars, and we got invited into one of their buildings, and in that building, underneath a bench, was this tarp. And my associate pulled the tarp off the engine, and in it was in the original crate, a Petty, what was rumored to be a Petty Hemi engine from 1964. Now, as you know, the Hemi launched in 1964, the 426. And we were very intrigued, and the owner said, not for sale. 2 weeks later, it was for sale, and we jumped on it, got the engine recovered. We brought it up to Illinois, and we started looking at it. We were curious. This is supposed to be a Petty engine, but how do we prove it? So my associate was good friends with a legend, Herb McCandless, Mr. Four-Speed. It was also very close friends with Petty Garage. And Petty Garage had a operations manager, Greg Stedman. And Greg said, hey, if you guys take pictures, there are certain markings on the engine that will determine whether it's a Petty engine or not. Come to find out that Richard Petty decided to take a personal interest in this engine. He called us, made an offer on the engine, and it was a tough thing to tell Richard, say, the engine's not for sale. However, this is what's on our mind. We would like to restore your car from 1964 because this engine was the number 11 engine that Maurice Petty Racing built in 1964. Think about that. The number 11 engine, and it had never been run in a race car. It was dynoed and was sitting in a crate. So Richard said, you know what? There's a lot of people that want all the new race cars. They want my cars from the late 60s, from the 70s, the 80s. But no one's asked about the car that's nearest and dearest, the one that started it all. This little baby, his first Daytona victory, his first Grand National victory. This started his career, and actually it memorialized the success of the Hemi in NASCAR racing. So we just happened to be at the right place at the right time. The whole idea was not to try to come up with a car that looks like the car that Richard raced. We wanted to duplicate the actual car that he raced. So Richard's team, Dale, Maurice, the rest of the gang, they were pulling out archives. They were pulling out blueprints of the original car. My associate did a fabulous job of sourcing original NASCAR parts from 1964. So, for instance, and this has been written up in various magazines, the exhaust headers are unique. Chrysler only built 250 sets of the cast iron headers. They're perfectly tuned for this engine. And it's a long story, but we found them hanging on a barn wall in northern Illinois. And the owner, once he realized the project that we were getting engaged with, he says, "They're yours." There was a price to pay, but he was generous enough to give us these headers because they belonged to his father, who raced some Hemi small track cars. The air cleaner is an original air cleaner, and I will open up the engine bay here in a second. We found that on a table in a guy's dining room in Cicero, and he sold that to us because he realized this project. There are many components of this car that hark back to what Richard actually raced in '64. And according to Petty Garage, this is the most accurate representation of that car. So I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud to share it. But what's important? What's important is when I was a kid, I had that little RCA black and white, watching the guys do the roundy rounds. And his just eyes just lit up and just fell in love with it. And these cars, the drivers, were bigger than life. And later in life, to be able to get together with one of the true legends of any sport and be able to bring something back in life that's near and dear to him and to the sport is an honor and a privilege. This was made in the 60s, and it was very typical of the NASCAR air intakes, and the air is pulled from the cowl, and it goes through there. It's a very clean laminar flow. And it obviously gets injected into the carburetor. The carburetor, I'm not going to take this air cleaner off, is from Cotton Owens' garage. It was from Cotton's personal inventory, and it is from 1964. The intake manifold is a 1964 NASCAR intake manifold. So unlike so many Hemis that you read about, it's only a single 4-barrel carburetor, and very efficient. And the rest of the components that are in this engine are they're all accurate. They're historically accurate. They're all from that era. So this engine really is the same engine that you would have found on the track in 1964. Now this interior, you look at it and you're wanting to say, hey, it's a race car. How come it doesn't look like a race car? We got the roll bar. We've got all the metal sheeting along the walls. There's no rear seat. But look, we've got a bench seat in here. The passenger side back is missing. But in 1964, NASCAR rules dictated you could not use bucket seats. It had to be the original bench seat that came with the car from the factory. So this is very typical of what you would have found from that era. But what's very unique about this is when the Hemi launched it for Daytona, this engine generated so much power and so much speed. They were going at least on the trial laps 10 miles an hour faster than anything they had done before. So what Richard found was that there was so much centrifugal force being generated against his body as he was going through the turns, he was slipping. So they came up with a little solution at the track. They took a couple 2x4s, screwed them together, covered them with fabric, and then they bolted it into the seat back, and that prevented him from sliding. Ingenious, at the track solution. No cost, but it solved a huge problem. Another thing that's interesting is the simplicity of the interior. There's only 3 gauges: oil, water, and the tachometer. Well, wait a minute. How about the fuel gauge? Well, how do you know how much fuel is in the car? So they knew when to go and pull into the pits. Very simple. When they got into the pits, they took off the gas cap and they put a stick in there and found out how much fuel was in there by the stick. That's what Dale Inman told me. But, it's just one thing after another that you look at the simplicity of the car. The steering wheel, it's all electrician's tape. That's how Richard raced the car, with just electrician's tape. Everywhere you look inside the vehicle, you'll see items that you can't believe that they got away with the safety margins or the lack of the safety margins. And just to give you an idea, this car in 1964 was going on the straightaways 186 miles an hour on the straightaways. Fastest lap speeds were, think about this, 156 miles an hour in 1964. When you look at the overall car, you can understand and go that fast, but to go 500 miles and put your body through that kind of risk, the heat, the vapors, Richard really, and all of his peers, they put their life on the line when they race these cars. And my purpose, which is in line with what Richard wanted to do when he took on this project, we wanted to preserve history. And we want people to know the risk that they took every time they got behind these cars, behind the wheel of these cars. And Richard that year raced 62 races in one season. And it's not just super speedways. They raced on dirt tracks. They raced on gravel. They raced concrete, asphalt. They were out there. This was how they made a living. And they took it all on. And guess what? Richard, the Petty family, they won. And this set a mark for that dynasty. But the fuel tank, you think of all these fuel cells, so cars won't, when they get rear-ended in a race, which you see happen all the time, the explosion of gasoline. Well, Richard insisted, no fuel cell. I raced this car with a regular gas tank. I want people to know the risks that we took. In fact, he said that if we put a fuel cell in this car, he wasn't going to sign it. And I want people to know how courageous this generation of drivers were, because there were almost no safety margins in this car other than the roll cage. Wow, these guys are heroes. They're my heroes, and I'm so lucky to share this, and I want people to be inspired by not by what I have been able to put together, but what these people, how they put their life on the line every week when they got behind the wheel. It's an incredible story.